Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Florida Pulse. I'm Tony DORIS, editorial page editor for the Palm Beach Post. Today we'll be talking about lessons we're learning from the collapse of Surfside's Champlain Tower South that will impact condo owners and residents throughout Florida for years to come. Journalists co-hosting with me today are John TORRES, engagement editor for Florida Today, and KRYS FLUKER, opinion editor, Daytona Beach News Journal. Our expert panelists are Paul Novack, lawyer and former longtime mayor of Surfside, and Matthew SHAPIRO at KRYS law firm in Daytona Beach. And hopefully Eugenio Santiago, former chief building official for Key Biscayne, will be joining us as well. To all of you, don't hesitate to jump in if you have something to say, better a lively discussion than an orderly one. Well, the dust has barely settled on the June 24th collapse of the 12-story building just north of Miami Beach. Horribly, despite the best efforts of all involved, we're still not sure if the last body has been recovered. That doesn't mean we can't immediately start looking for ways to prevent the next tragedy anywhere in Florida. Paul Novack, having spent time at the site and understanding how governments work, what's your sense of how and where this problem needs to be addressed, considering that we still don't know precisely what caused this collapse?
Well, Tony, at this time, I think we always need to keep our focus on the victims and keep their tragedy in mind, and also the first responders who have just done such incredible work. And there'll be a lot to be said about that. In terms of where we go, though, Tony, and your question, my feeling is that what we need is not a whole lot of separate, independent suggestions, bills, ordinances coming from various individuals and from all sides. But what we need to look at is coming up with a comprehensive strategy that involves all of the components. The possibility of a living CO, construction codes, maintenance requirements, inspection schedules, mandatory reserves, reporting requirements for professional engineers, the insurance costs and risks issues, perhaps a revolving loan fund at no interest for the financial issues. But to look at all of the aspects and bring together a comprehensive approach that works together cooperatively, rather than just a smorgasbord of individual proposals that really will not change the situation long term.
Well, if I could, one follow-up question, maybe for Matthew SHAPIRO. One of the issues that seems to have been definitely ascertained at Champlain Towers South was the time that it took for the condo association and the city and whatever other authorities were there to react to already knowing about the problem. And I'm wondering if we have a comprehensive approach, doesn't that take time? How do we go about condensing the speed with which, A, we get something in place now, and B, as we go into the future, how do we make the process just faster?
Well, Tony, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I fully agree with everything Paul said about the comprehensive approach. I admit that it doesn't necessarily lend itself to speed. My thought would be, first and foremost, any of the buildings that are in high-risk areas as far as age and geographic location to salt water would probably need to be quickly inspected, and that would need to be overseen by the state. But one of the things that I'm really campaigning for, at least from my vantage point, is removing some of the impediments to these boards and to the entities themselves in order to effectively maintain the condominiums. I think as more information comes out, we're really going to see an increase in the fact that there's an underlying problem of boards and directors not being able to accomplish maintenance goals due to political pressures within the condominiums.
I have a follow-up for Matthew, if that's okay. What happens, Matthew, when the condo owners themselves can't afford assessments to do some of these repairs?
Well, it's kind of like it or not, they have to be able to afford the assessments. I mean, what we're talking about here is unbudgeted work, capital expenditures that are not covered by the reserves, or the reserves are insufficient. And if that's the case, really the association is left with two methods to raise the funds: a loan, which typically involves some sort of special assessments, or special assessments themselves, which, for those listening, that's basically an assessment that is not related to the budget, 14 days notice is required to pass the assessment, and it can range anywhere from a few $1,000s to six figures, north of six figures, as we've seen in this particular instance. So really, so much of it is about proper budgeting and proper maintenance of the reserves leading up to that special assessment. Because if they can't afford it, a lien is placed on the unit, and the unit is sold via a foreclosure sale. So you're really talking about people at risk to lose their units if they can't pay these assessments, which I think relates back to making sure things are well and properly funded in the first place.
Yeah, I used to live in a condo, and they financed it for us. It was reasonable. There was a big assessment for repairs, and they had very low interest financing, and everybody could do it.
Is there do unit owners have a right to turn down reserves? I seem to recall some condos I was in where they could devote and they can say, no, we don't want to keep reserves. We don't.
Unfortunately, they can, and they've been doing that. And then when it hits, they don't have any money. I think that's what happened in the Chapelin Towers.
Tony, you mind if I speak on that real quick?
Sure.
So just to take a very convoluted issue and give the Reader's Digest version, each year a proposed budget is created and sent out to the members. But before that budget is actually adopted and put into effect, there is the right of the membership, meaning all of the unit owners, not just the board of directors, but the actual unit owners, to vote to waive the funding of the reserves for that particular year. And the frightening part is not only that it can be waived, it's the amount of votes you need to reach that threshold. It's not based on the total number of units. It's a majority of those present when quorum is established. So just to take it very simply, if you've got 100 units and quorum is 50%, then you only need 26 votes in theory at a membership meeting to waive the funding of the reserves for that particular year. So it's not a high threshold.
Okay.
And that's really a wrong approach. Insurance companies and financial institutions are required to have reserves because things happen. And they're dealing with other people's money and in some cases, other people's safety. And it's the same situation here. These boards should be required to have reserves and not be permitted to just waive them year after year after year, just punting it downfield, kicking the can, and avoiding responsibility. Because these boards have a responsibility not only to the owners, but it really is a public safety issue also.
Yeah, you're right.
And I think that kind of brings in the question then of, does the state or should the state help fund some of these improvements? Because especially with these older condos, it's very hard to find somebody who's responsible.
I think it's problematic to have the state funding private properties all across the state. I think perhaps it should be looked at now because right now the federal government is involved with bills pertaining to national infrastructure. And perhaps within that legislation at the federal level, there should be loan funds established for private properties to be able to access funds, interest-free perhaps, for structural repair purposes. And so we have to look at the financial situation as well as everything else, because we can't just mandate a responsibility that's impossible to fulfill.
I'm wondering how you set it up so that these condo associations either have help, carrot and stick. These are complicated requirements that they're asked to deal with, and they don't necessarily have expertise in finance or even in construction. And so what kind of help, is it even possible for the state or the county or the city to provide so that, if a condo gets into trouble like this or gets behind the ball, somebody makes sure that things happen? I mean, any of you, what is the most responsible way to address the fact that condo associations don't necessarily have the expertise or the will to do the right thing?
Yeah, Tony, I'll be happy to tackle that. I think we have to even take a step back and say, who are these directors on these associations? I've never run across directors that are, cartoonish, twirling the mustache, chuckling, trying to do a bad job at what they're doing. They all mean well, or 99% of them mean well. You're typically talking about retirees of varying educational backgrounds that are tasked with understanding complex legal documents, multiple statutes, sections of our administrative code, and they're given a fiduciary duty to their members, and for this task they're paid $0, or almost all of them are paid $0. And so when they meet resistance or things get difficult, the natural inclination is to just step back and not do it, or to resign and let someone else do it. So to me, part of it is taking the political pressure off of them and just increasing the clarity of what's required. So I would personally like to see, when we talk about reforms, a clear formula of how the reserves are supposed to work, and more oversight from the state, not at the taxpayer expense, but at the expense of the condominiums, an approach of basically mandating what maintenance needs to be done and when it needs to be done. I understand not all condos are exactly the same. There needs to be a tiered system reflective of the type of structure and where it's located, but I think we need to take the political pressure off the directors so that they're not, the quote unquote bad guys when they're trying to raise the funds that need to be raised.
And perhaps also they shouldn't just be uninformed and uneducated about the areas of their own responsibility. Nobody forces somebody to seek a position on a condo board. If they seek it, then they should be up to the task. For example, many professions are required to have continuing education, and condo boards could be required to have mandatory education in areas like structural matters and budgeting matters, and understand what their responsibilities are. Because we've had some training, but the funding for it has been diverted, as happens in many budgets at statewide, and it's been overlooked. But I think a mandatory obligatory training and education to board members should be one part of a multifaceted approach.
Can we?
I have something for Gene. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Gene, on the engineering part of this, with so many condos and high rises on Florida's coastline, are there any modern engineering techniques that we can offer, or that are being done to enhance these like buildings to prevent saltwater decay and seawater on these things? And can any of those things be used on older buildings as well?
I think something we need to keep in mind, guys, is that this certification is only being mandated right now in Broward and Dade County. And Dade County is the only county in the whole state that checks structural calculation. So that's a big problem, because if you have people submitting calculations that nobody checking for the certification, self-certification, if they send a report and there's no backup on the county to review it, nor with knowledge and evaluate it, that's a problem, because we got two counties that require it. Only one of them really checks it, and then the other counties, I don't know how many they are in the state, nobody checks anything, as far as I know, because this is only on the Administrative Chapter of the Florida Building Code for Broward and for Miami-Dade County. I don't know what they're doing in Palm Beach and Lehigh. I don't know what they're doing, but unless it's voluntary, nobody's checking anything.
I think that's a very good point, because there's been a lot of criticism that Dade's rule is too lenient, but it's the only county that really tried to do anything at all about it. Yeah. And then Broward followed suit, and Palm Beach is looking at it now. But there should be statewide requirements. I'm very familiar with the collapse of the building downtown Miami in 1974. And what I think most people don't know is when the recertification rule was first proposed back then in 74, 75, it was proposed as a 25-year recertification rule. And in the process, it got amended and became 40 years. And now people are talking again about 25 years. Maybe it should be a lot sooner and more frequent and more invasive, more extensive inspections. And maybe it should be statewide. And these issues don't apply only to towers. The Unger building was a 2-story building with parking on top. And we need to look at the construction, the inspections. One other thing I just want to throw out, and maybe Gene will comment, is I'm also concerned about many buildings that are deemed fine and safe because they have had repairs and renovations. But there are certain materials that perhaps were not appropriate. Gunite applied to exposed rebar was just taking a sand and concrete mix with salt and putting it right on the rebar and then closing it up, and it would pass final inspection. So how many buildings do we have that were addressed and were repaired, but that are ticking in terms of a problem is coming? So we need to look at a lot of things that have happened over these past decades and try to bring it all up to speed and up to a new code.
You almost need to do a biopsy of some of these buildings to actually dig in and see how the repairs were made and whether they were done right. But I'm also wondering, when you talk about statewide changes, does it make sense to have a rule for the entire state when some properties are close to the shore and some aren't? I mean, I realize the hurricane maps show that the hurricanes crisscross the state and doesn't matter where you are particularly. But I know you're going to get a lot of fight from the construction industry if they suddenly have to build to a stronger standard inland.
They're going to push.
Gene,
they're going to push back anyway because they don't want anything to be done ever. That's the way they always been pushing back about a structural plan review. They don't want it. They'd rather just go ahead and do it. But another thing that we got to talk about, and the state needs to talk about, or whoever is going to take over this, is that 40-year certifications are really inadequate, okay? You walk around the building, you report what you see. That means that it's exposed. But if you go into this high-end condos, all the finishes are hidden behind marble and heavy, wallpaper and whatever. So you really cannot see anything unless it's so bad that it blends through the wallpaper or the marble, So I think that we should mandate, this reserve for the association, that they take a representative number of apartments, at least 2, and remove all the finishes. So we can see, because the major damage occurs on the columns and the slab, especially if it's a flat slab that can fail in punching shear like this building did. And if you don't see it, you can't report it. So what's the point of doing a 4-year certification if you're not really looking at the structure? That's something that we need to look at really hard.
Okay.
If I can comment briefly on that, 2 things. One, we already under our Florida Condominium Act have different tiers for different requirements, whether that is auditing, financial audits, whether that's certain requirements about websites that are based on the sizes of these units, how many members we have. So I don't think there's going to be a problem with people smarter than me in that particular construction industry and engineering field making different tiers of requirements for different types of buildings. My question is, well, how are these associations going to pay for it? I fully agree that we need to have more frequent, stricter testing, including what Gene was talking about, actual destructive testing, where you're not just visually looking at things. But those inspections are very, very expensive, which I think goes back to funding of reserves and what needs to be required in reserves, so that when the time comes to do the testing, the money's already there, and it's not a political nuclear football for the boards to get that testing done.
Then the question I have is, who's responsible for all this enforcement? Is a small town capable of making sure all this testing gets done? Should there just be a system where a private engineer has to sign off on it? Or should the state have a system, or should it be a county-wide function? Who is the...
I think they should delegate that to structural engineers, licensed structural engineers, to certify the building. But of course, in a better way that we're certifying now, more comprehensive, more in-depth look at it. But I don't think that there is no county in the whole state that has the personnel to handle this. You need to delegate it to registered structural engineer, not architect, structural engineer with experience, and then they can inspect the building and certify. That's my opinion.
I think municipalities and the counties and the state have the ability to do that. They need to contract with structural engineers that have no conflict of interest and do not also represent buildings or developers and have different issues on their plate. But this needs to be a very clean and accountable system where these structural engineers who do the work on behalf of the governments have one obligation, and that is to help ensure public safety.
But again, this goes back to the fact that only Dade County checks calculation, and only Dade County is going to check that report. Everybody else is going to stuff it in a drawer and say, okay, you got certified, go for it. So, that's something we need to look at because, it's like the elephant in the room. Nobody else is looking at it, except Dade County.
KRYS?
I think there should also be an obligation on the part of consulting engineers that if they find a condition that's a potential safety issue, then they must report it directly to the jurisdictions with authority over that building.
That's part of the canon of ethics. You see something like that, you got to contact the building department and let them know. If not, it can go against your license.
Apparently, it's not been happening.
Yeah. Well, I have a question from one of our readers that I'd like to work in. And that is, given that there are so many of these already built, are there any common elements among the ones that are going to be the most trouble, like built in a particular era, built in a particular part of the state? Is there some, are there warning signs that should let us prioritize which
well, there was a building boom that people were using salt water to mix with concrete, and that had catastrophic results. I have inspected all buildings in Miami Beach. All you got is a rust mark where the bar used to be. Nothing left. So, it's a problematic thing. And the funny thing with that building is that the wood for the floor was in prime condition. It was like it was built yesterday. But the concrete was gone. There was nothing left. They had to tear it down.
Just to piggyback off of that, what I typically see in my practice is two areas, and not to represent that this is intended to say that someone's building is going to fall down or there's an immediate safety threat, but where we usually see problems is windows, usually because they're not well defined in governing documents about who has the responsibility for them or the responsibility has been shifted, and then balconies, because although you're supposed to be funding reserves for capital expenditures in excess of $10,000, it's not necessarily its own identified category. We usually have good reserves for things like roofs, painting, paving, but balcony and concrete restoration, not so much. So that's usually where we see shortages with associations that result in special assessments, which in turn result in fighting and delay.
Is there any way to know how widespread the problem is, statewide? And, is it a matter of not if, but when is this going to happen again?
It can be happening in any building in the state. If it's not being maintained, you're going to have problems, The design usually is not an issue on this kind of work because if a building's been there 40 years and didn't have any major problem, you can assume it was designed properly. But if it hasn't been maintained, it can look like complaint towers, and come down any minute.
And I'd even play devil's advocate with that and say, right now, obviously, it's in the news because a building collapsed. But we've got a lot of buildings I don't think are probably not going to collapse. But the problem is that we've got people who purchase into these units where maintenance has been delayed, reserves aren't funded, and then their owner's there for 3 months and they're hit with a special assessment of $50,000. And a lot of them are retirees on fixed income. So the work doesn't get done or they end up losing their unit to foreclosure. So I would say that, the problem goes beyond the basic structural integrity. I think we also have an underlying problem of people purchasing into very bad situations with no realistic way of knowing that ahead of time.
Yeah, we need to mandate inspections and maintenance for the building somehow. Because, for example, I had a building in the Fort Lauderdale back in the 70s. They called me in to, doing repair design. I came up with a contractor. We gave him an estimate, and it was going to be like $6 million. I said, no, we can't afford that. Well, they came back 15 years later, and it had gone to $80 million. So at that point, it was too late. But if you don't do it on a timely basis, and you're right next to the water, that salt air is just killing your building. It's a cancer that's growing bigger and bigger every day. And it gets to a point of no return that you can't fix it anymore.
It's a whole cultural issue too, because we all buy our real estate, we all buy our homes. We pay as much as we possibly can afford to get the most house or condo unit we can get. And so to think that you suddenly have to come up with $30,000 or $50,000 out of nowhere to pay for, for an assessment, it's really hard on anyone. I don't know how you get around that other than also having some kind of statewide realtors education program to encourage people not to bite off more than they can chew when they're buying the house in the first place.
And Tony,
Go ahead.
Tony, it's a great point, and let me phrase it this way: when you go to buy your home, you get a home inspection, and your home inspector crawls all over that home and tells you what's wrong with it, and hopefully you have an ethical seller that tells you if there's anything that you may not be aware of. But with condos, okay, your home inspector comes and inspects the unit, but they're not putting up scaffolding and climbing all over that building and doing destructive testing. They're not going into the garages and looking at the pillars and the pool and those types of things. Yeah. And people say, well, check the reserves, see if they're well funded. But the average person has no way of knowing what a properly funded reserve is, especially when, I mean, yes, there's a formula, but what useful life is and anticipated repairs, I mean, a lot of that's up to the discretion of the association. So you're really going in blind, at least under the current laws as they stand.
Now, I just wanted to ask you guys one more thing. Recently Miami-Dade actually shut down, evacuated a couple of buildings after the fact, after what happened, they saw what happened in Surfside. What do you think about that? I mean, I kind of thought, well, that is as good a way as any to wake condo associations up, that if they don't get things fixed, your building could be evacuated. Should there be more of that?
Well, just right now, if your building does not get the 40-year certification, is one of the conditions to be declared unsafe. And you go to the Unsafe Structures Board, and they declare the building unsafe. And that's kind of like a big club. I used to hit the association over the head to make them do the repairs, because hey, if you don't get this certified, you're going to have to evacuate the building because we're going to declare it unsafe. And at that point, they respond. But if they don't know that, nobody made them aware of that, then there's a problem.
And that's really at the end of a bad road. Perhaps all along there should be additional disclosure requirements for the sellers. And maybe that'll work as an incentive or a motivation. If you as a seller of a unit in a condo must disclose to a potential buyer what is known about structural integrity, about maintenance, about reserves. And if you say, well, I don't know, perhaps the person isn't going to purchase that unit. And this becomes an incentive to do things right as you go along. Otherwise, all the units in the building become unsellable. So I think we need to look at various incentives and requirements and enforcement to work as a new system.
So, Paul, should there be like a rating system for reserves? Because if I'm buying a condo and they say they have $1 million in reserves, I don't know if that's good or bad for that building. But should maybe at state level, somebody should say for that building, you get an A+ rating for that level of reserves. So that people know, who are buyers, can legitimately beware if the building is a D- as far as reserves or not. Because how do you, as an individual buyer who knows nothing about construction, determine how much is the right amount of reserves?
That would involve very complicated formulas, and I'm not sure we could really rely on them as much as we would want to. But I think that increased frequency and invasiveness of inspections, like the panel has talked about, where the inspections are real and invasive, not just can I see cracks in a column, and then more frequent, more regular, and made public in the situations where there's a danger, and always disclosed to sellers and all unit owners. I think openness and transparency and communication can be one factor towards a lot of improvement.
Okay. And being proactive rather than getting it at the tail end.
Well, going back to one of my original points, if you don't force the building to expose X number of apartments for inspection, meaning really inspection, look at the floor. See, for example, what is called flat plate. That's a frame that is only columns and slab. And there's got no beams, nothing. The most critical failure is what is called the punching chair, where the slab fails around the column. When it does that, it drops. Once it drops, it just causes a catastrophic collapse all the way to the ground floor. So if you go into an apartment and it's got marble on the floor and you can't see any cracks on it, meaning not that they're not, just that they're not visible, it's the inspection is worthless. What are you inspecting? You got pretty wallpaper, you got pretty carpet, that's not good enough if you want to safeguard your family. That's the problem. I don't know how to get around that.
We have time for a last question from any of our panelists, either of you, from the hosts.
Actually, we had a really good question posed to us, which is, each of you, if you had one wish, if you could change one thing to make condos safer, give people more security, prevent another tragedy, what would it be?
I will say expose the structure and save money to do that, because you're going to have to take out the finishes and replace them afterwards. So that's going to be added cost. And some of these apartments, they're worth millions of dollars. So I don't know how it's going to be done. But again, if you don't see the structure, any inspection that you do is worthless, because you're not looking at the real problem. You're looking at the skin, and you're not looking at the bone, which may be broken by then. So that's something that we need to face, make it reserve more money for that.
Matt,
Sure,
how about you?
I think it starts and ends with the reserves, if we can just pick one thing. The current associations have the mechanisms in place to assess and do what they need to do, but it's the political pressure. And you're going to remove that if the reserves are well funded. So I'd start with no ability to waive the reserves. That shouldn't be an option. I think greater oversight from the state about what proper reserves are to look like. Based on, not only saying take the useful life and the expense, but really saying on a per condominium basis, this is the applicable useful life and expense and what you need to have in reserves. So I think if the reserves are well funded, you're going to be able to pay for the inspections, and you're going to be able to handle the maintenance issues as they arise.
Paul Novack, you get the last word.
Well, I think those two sets of suggestions are excellent. And I think if it's combined with a new level of accountability and transparency, so that when problems exist in a particular building, they don't stay just within that particular building. They have to be reported to all the unit owners, whether they're there and voting or not, and they have to be reported to local and state authorities so they can step in if the building fails to do so.
Yeah, perfect. I want to thank our guests, Paul Novack, Eugenio Santiago, and Matthew Shapiro, and our co-hosts, John Torres and KRYS FLUKER, and I'm Tony Doris, and thank you. We'll see you next time on Florida Pulse.
Thank you.
Thank you.